And now, Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
I hate those endings where they bring everybody back and go, well, what do you know? They're not dead after all. Yippee. But shouldn't one of the people who walked out of the closet at the end of that movie been that dead construction worker? Alive and well, like the kids and the dog? Maybe there's some kind of statute of limitations on being brought back to life after being sucked into the walls by evil gremlins. I'm not familiar with these technicalities. Or am I going to get a bunch of letters, you know? Hey, Joe Bob, you moron, the zombie is just a figment of the kid's imagination based on Terry's story brought to life by the demons. So I've said it for you so you can put your pencils down, okay? Okay, I'm Joe Bob Briggs, and up next is Twilight Zone, the movie, which is worth seeing if you never have seen it. But first, I want to remind you that next week we have Babies from Hell in the great Larry Cohen double feature, It's Alive, and the sequel, It Lives Again. There's only one thing wrong with the Martin baby. It's alive. Anyhow, Twilight Zone, the movie, coming up right now, and unfortunately, this movie is mainly remembered for one thing. While they were making it, they had a horrible helicopter accident that killed Vic Morrow and 2 Vietnamese children. But if you can put that out of your mind, and of course now you can't possibly put it out of your mind because I just brought it up, but assuming you could try to put it out of your mind, it's not a bad movie. For some reason, people either love or hate this movie. The idea was to reproduce the spirit of the original Twilight Zone TV series, and I'm all for that because I think Rod Serling was probably one of the 4 or 5 greatest writers in the history of television. I don't think they quite pull it off. Rod's style was better and the stories were better in black and white, frankly. It's almost like this movie is too big for its own good, but it comes pretty close. 4 big-name directors did 4 different stories. John Landis, Steven Spielberg, Joe Dante, and George Miller, the George Miller of Road Warrior fame. And the general consensus is that 2 of the 4 are good and 2 of the 4 suck. But I won't tell you which ones till it's over so you can make up your own mind. Okay, let's take a look at the drive-in totals and we'll get it started. We have 2 dead bodies, 1 zombie, 3 shootouts, 1 flaming Klansman, 1 giant snake, man-eating lizard, exploding TV set, 1 pig-headed smoke monster, 1 demon at 30,000 feet with huge claws and a tail, 3 stars. Check it out and I'll be here all night to give you the inside skinny, okay? Everybody tries to do Rod Serling. Everybody wants to write like him, make shows like him, but nobody can quite get it down. The man was a genius. WLW-TV Cincinnati, that's where he started. You ever go to downtown Cincinnati on the weekend? Twilight Zone. Bet that's where he got his idea.
Back to Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
Well, that was a pretty lousy place to cut for a commercial with Vic Morrow trying to escape from the Ku Klux Klan. But this was, of course, Vic's last performance. He died during the making of the film, and Vic was a great actor. He started in the 50s. He did a lot of off-Broadway theater in New York, did a lot of classical roles in Mexico City, of all places, and then he made his film debut in 1955 in The Blackboard Jungle. Got great reviews as the disturbed street kid in that flick. And then he spent his whole life trying to get some kind of role where he was not a heavy or a disturbed guy or the nasty guy. But as you can see, here he is still doing it in his last film, so it really didn't work. The only time he got to be a real honest-to-God hero was when he starred in Combat for 5 seasons in the 60s. But then by the end of the 60s, he'd gotten a divorce from his first wife, Barbara Turner. He was depressed about that. And he didn't get to see his 2 daughters, and he was depressed about that. And he was not getting any good acting parts, and he was depressed about that. And then he gave one of the greatest performances of his life as the coach in the Bad News Bears, coach of the other team, the one Walter Matthau competes against. Remember how you just hated him? And that led to nothing for him. And then his own daughter started getting more famous as an actor than he was, Jennifer Jason Leigh. And so he ended up doing really cheap B movies, and he played the commodities markets, and he drank a lot. And it was Twilight Zone, the movie, that he thought would give him his big comeback role. But he told the director, John Landis, that he was worried about the final scene of his story because he had a premonition many years before that he would die in a helicopter accident. And so around 2 o'clock in the morning on the night of July 23rd, 1982, they were shooting that scene next to a mock Vietnamese village in Indian Dunes Park, which is just north of Los Angeles. And the village was supposed to totally blow up as Vic waded across the Santa Clara River with 2 young Vietnamese children. He was holding 1 child in each arm, and a helicopter gunship was going to come down and try to gun him down. So they start the scene, and the explosions were much more powerful than they expected, and the copter came down lower than it was supposed to, and the heat and the force of the explosions caused the copter to go out of control. And the first thing that happened was that there was so much wind that Vic lost control of the little girl he was holding, and so she fell into the water, and the copter crashed into the river, and one of the skids of the copter crushed the girl, killed her instantly, and then it veered in another direction, and it decapitated the young boy, and it decapitated Vic. And 4 years later, they had a trial. It lasted almost a year, and the director, John Landis, and 4 other people were found not guilty of involuntary manslaughter they were charged with. And that's why you will not be seeing the scene and why this segment just kind of peters out at the end. Okay, back to the movie.
Back to Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
Scatman Crothers. Isn't he great? This second segment was directed by Steven Spielberg, which is why it's so syrupy and sentimental. You either love it or you hate it. And it sucked me in, I have to admit it. Originally, Spielberg was going to do a Twilight Zone episode that had a bunch of special effects and monsters and stuff in it, but he didn't have time to do it because in 1981, Raiders of the Lost Ark came out. In 1982, E.T. came out. Suddenly, he was the most powerful man in the movie business and the guy whose time was most in demand, so he chose this story from the original TV series because it was basically easy to shoot, and he could just give it that Spielberg glow. Okay, back to the flick. Of course, I hate that Spielberg glow. But don't shoot me, because last time I said that, there were ladies in Omaha trying to have me deported to Pakistan. It's un-American to say that sometimes Steven Spielberg is just a little sentimental, you know? He makes movies that Mom loves more than Dad. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Until Saving Private Ryan, he finally made one for Dad.
Back to Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
So, as Scatman Crothers moseys on down the road, 2 episodes down and 2 to go, this might be a good place to read a little inmate viewer mail in the segment we call Joe Bob's Jailbreak. And to help me out tonight is the TNT mail girl, the irresistible Rusty. Rusty, did you watch Twilight Zone when you were growing up?
Oh, sure, everyone did.
What was your favorite episode?
I think it was the one probably with Burgess Meredith, where he has all the time in the world to read finally, and then his glasses break.
Really? That's your favorite? The one about a guy who reads?
Well, he's so vulnerable. Women like that.
I'm vulnerable. You want to see my vasectomy scar?
No.
I'm not afraid to cry. I cried when I got that vasectomy.
Here's a letter.
I think I'm going to cry right now just remembering that my sperm will never fertilize an ovum.
Huh, I feel safer already.
Yes.
This letter is from Joey Hood. He is at the South Central Correctional Facility in Clifton, Tennessee.
2 letters from Tennessee tonight. Dear Joe Bob, I am a prisoner in the South Central Correctional Facility's close custody unit. Close custody unit? That doesn't sound good, Joey. I thoroughly enjoy watching you and Honey, our previous mail girl, on TNT's Monstervision. I previously submitted a letter to you in hopes that you'd choose to read it on the air. I hope that this one is read on the air. On this date during Donovan's brain, you attempted to obtain Honey's company for a weekend in Vegas. Your heart was in the right place. Your diplomacy, tact, approach, and deliverance was less than to be desired. I myself would have given her the BBD, the biggest and best deal. A couple of weeks in Monte Carlo with me, a rich and handsome man, not a couple of days at a dive like the Mirage. Honey strikes me as a lady of taste and class, therefore deserves the best. When you spoke about your favorite uncle's last words, it made me melancholy to my favorite and third late wife's last words, honey, why are you loading that gun? Anyway, how about a Nightmare on Elm Street trilogy? Keep up the good work. Give my regards to Honey and Viva La Drive-In. Since, you know, Honey broke my heart. She ran off with some guy from Sweden or something. Sincerely, Joey Hood, number 160359. P.S. If you can't read this one on the air, write back and let me know why. Well, I don't have time to do that. That's why I read it on the air, Joey. But I don't know when we'll get to a Nightmare trilogy, but we got a serious Friday the 13th marathon coming up on Halloween, 6 movies, and we'll be tracing the evolution of Jason. Sounds like something you might be interested in, Joey. Okay, South Central Prison is a privately operated institution opened in 1992, located in Clifton, Tennessee, which is near the Alabama-Mississippi border. So most of the guys are probably related to each other one way or another. 1,500 male inmates, medium to minimum security, mostly long-term. Their specialty is a rebuilding program where the state brings in old computers and the inmates tear them apart and refurbish them and give them to schools. And the assistant warden there told us that Monstervision was on way past his bedtime. So you guys out there watching without supervision, be good. Free your mind and your butt will follow. So what do you say, Rusty? Do you want to take a trip to the Riviera with me?
This guy tells you to invite me to Monte Carlo, and you still say Vegas. That is so insulting.
No, that is Monte Carlo. No, Rusty, they copied the Riviera in France. It's the same.
Back to Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
Okay, just a couple little trivia things about the segment we're watching now. It's called It's a Good Life, and it was originally an episode of The Twilight Zone in 1963. And in the very first scene, the guy in the diner who keeps complaining because the TV keeps screwing up and he can't watch the boxing match, that actor is Bill Mumy. And in the original episode, he played the kid. So Joe Dante directed this one, and he wanted to use Bill Mumy as a tribute to that original episode. Also, Bill Mumy can be seen in the current hit TNT series, Babylon 5. Okay, also, Joe Dante hired the veteran character actor Dick Miller to be the owner of the diner. And that character's name is Walter Paisley. The 5th time Dick Miller has played a character named Walter Paisley in a movie. Dick Miller used to make cheap, low-budget movies for Roger Corman, king of the exploitation filmmakers, back in the late 50s and early 60s. And one of his most famous ones is Bucket of Blood in 1959, where he plays the nerdy sculptor Walter Paisley. So when Joe Dante directed his first movie in 1976, it was a send-up of all those old B movies, and it was called Hollywood Boulevard, and he hired Dick Miller to play Walter Paisley again. And then he used him in Piranha, and he used him in The Howling, and each time he hired him, he called him Walter Paisley in the script. So it's kind of an elaborate movie in-joke, because Dick is one of those great actors who is loved by directors, but not that well-known to the general public. So anyway, they changed this episode quite a bit, and I don't want to give it away, so back to the movie. You know, it's funny to me that they wanted to do a tribute to the Twilight Zone TV series, but they didn't use a single episode that was actually written by Rod Serling. I don't think Rod would have cared for that opening with Dan Aykroyd and Albert Brooks, you know? Because did Rod ever use scary monster heads and stuff like that? I don't think so. But I'm grumpy.
Back to Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
And so ends the Joe Dante segment, which most people consider the best one in the whole movie, mostly due to those really cool cartoon effects and the way the whole thing looks like Cartoon Land. When this movie came out, it failed at the box office, but it was still credited for starting that whole Anthology TV craze of the 80s. Like The Twilight Zone went back into syndication. Alfred Hitchcock Presents went into syndication. Steven Spielberg did Amazing Stories, even though, in my opinion, most of those weren't that amazing. Some of them were hardly even stories. And now for the final segment, directed by George Miller of Mad Max and the Road Warrior fame, which, in my opinion, is the best one in the movie. So let's check it out. Normally, if I hear the words anthology film, I say, no, I'd rather have a fireplace poker plunge through my scrotum, you know? But this one is almost bearable, you know?
Back to Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
John Lithgow is amazing. I watch him do this part and I start sweating. This movie came out just when the world had first discovered John Lithgow, right after he was nominated for the Oscar in The World According to Garp as Roberta Muldoon, remember? The transsexual football player. I wonder how he feels about that, because, yeah, I was toiling in relative obscurity, working on the New York stage, and then bingo, that once-in-a-lifetime role as a cross-dressing NFL wide receiver came along. But he did become a star pretty late in his career. He grew up in Rochester, where his father was a producer of Shakespeare. Now, I don't know how producing Shakespeare in Rochester is a full-time job, but that's what his bio says. And then he went to Harvard, and he did the whole London acting training thing, and he worked for the Royal Shakespeare Company. He won a Tony on Broadway for The Changing Room in 1973. He had small parts in All That Jazz and Blowout, and then Viola, World According to Garp, Terms of Endearment, Twilight Zone the movie, Third Rock from the Sun. He was an overnight genius. Okay, roll the film. Those phone company commercials. You know who played the airline passenger in the original Twilight Zone episode? Everybody knows this. You don't know this? William Shatner. But how could Captain Kirk ever be scared enough to do this story? You know, one raised eyebrow. That's terror in William Shatner terms. You know, we're going to die, warp speed. He's not the most emotional actor, you know?
Back to Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
The Gremlin on the Wing, played by a young actor and dancer named Larry Cedar. Pretty great gremlin. And now we head for the thrill-a-second conclusion of Twilight Zone, the movie, as they try to land the plane before John Lithgow's body actually explodes from the rigors of intensive method acting. Okay, roll it. And the stewardess, by the way, the young stewardess is played by Donna Dixon, a model and cover girl and former star of Bosom Buddies, who is married to... That's right, Dan Aykroyd. But it was not the only time husband and wife worked in the same picture. They'll always be remembered as the co-stars of Dr. Detroit. Or maybe not. And one more thing. This is the exact 35th anniversary of the original William Shatner episode of The Twilight Zone with the Gremlin on the Wing. 35 years ago this week. And William Shatner looks the same, doesn't he? Actually, he's starting to look like John Lithgow, when you think about it.
Back to Joe Bob's Last Call and Twilight Zone, the movie on TNT.
All right, nobody does loony better than John Lithgow, and it is a Steven Spielberg-produced flick, so the credits are longer than the movie. Okay, remember, if you're pregnant, don't stay up for next week's flicks, because our Monstervision features are It's Alive and It Lives Again with mutant babies galore. That's it for me, Joe Bob Briggs, reminding you to follow your dream, unless it's the one where you're at work in your underwear during a fire drill. Did you guys hear the one about the two guys who were bungee jumping one day? And the first guy says to the second guy, you know, we could make a lot of money running our own bungee jumping business in Mexico. Well, the second guy thinks this is a great idea, so they pool their money and they buy everything they'll need. They buy a tower, an elastic cord, insurance. They go to Mexico and they start to set up on a plaza. And while they're building the tower, this crowd starts to gather, and pretty soon there's quite a large group of people. So the first guy goes to test the equipment. He jumps and he bounces at the end of the cord, and when he comes back up, the second guy sees that he has a few cuts and scratches on him, but he can't catch him, and so the first guy falls down again, and he bounces, and he comes back up, and he's bruised, and he's bleeding. And again, the second guy misses him. The first guy falls down, falls back again, and bounces back up. And this time he comes back, he's pretty messed up. He's got a couple of broken bones. He's almost unconscious. Luckily, the second guy finally catches him, and he says, what happened? Was the cord too long? And the first guy says, no, the cord was fine, but what the heck is a piñata? Joe Bob Briggs reminding you that the drive-in will never die. Hey, you know what happens when a lawyer takes Viagra? He grows 6 inches taller for an hour.